Today we're going to talk about reserve studies and how to manage them. I could summarize it very simply and say, just follow your study, and we can end it there. But we'll go through a little bit more, some tips and tricks on how you can manage a reserve study. But before we do that, let's do a quick refresher about what a reserve study is and the requirements for them. So what is a reserve study? It's your savings account, right? You have your operating checking where your dues go in, and then you have a separate account that you save money every month. You're putting money in there, and hopefully the amount of money you're putting in is what your reserve study is telling you to put in. So the replacement reserve is with the annual budget projected by the board to be adequate, very subjective word, but together with past and future contributions to the reserve to fund the replacement of those components of the community. Just a refresher for what the definition is by state statute. And remember, the state statute, MCIOA, the Minnesota Common Interest Ownership Act, defines it as that, and they list these four particular things that you need to remember about the reserves. So again, it has to be adequate. You need to be funding it to what your reserve study says that you need to make sure that all of those common components are replaced. You don't need to fund anything that has a lifespan greater than 30 years. So that's just a little thing to file away in the back of your head. And also the reserves should be kept in a separate account, like we talked about, your checking account, your operating checking, but then you have a separate account, kind of like your checking account, your checkbook at home, and then your savings for your retirement is a separate thing. And then you should reevaluate the adequacy of that plan every 3 years. That's what the state statute says in Minnesota. Now, none of that says that you have to have a reserve study, but a reserve study does accomplish those things. So that's what we're going to focus on. So now that you remember what a reserve study is and what the reserve requirements are, we want to talk just for a moment about how you then manage that reserve study. So one of the first things to look at, especially if you just recently had a reserve study, most likely you were underfunded. So you have to catch up. So the reserve study obviously lays out a 30-year plan of all the things you have to replace, how much that's going to cost over those 30 years, and then how much you need to fund every year. Every year it tells you $30,000, $80,000, whatever it is. And if you're newer to the reserve fund and study, most likely you're behind. So you have to catch up. So it has these large increments of cash flow to catch you up. So a lot of the questions that we get asked right away is, how much do we need in our reserve? Well, what reserve study companies do is they look at what's called threshold funding. There's 4 different types of funding, but they use what's called threshold funding. So they look at the critical low year of your reserve fund balance. So every year you have money going in and every year you have money going out, and what is that balance? So when you look at an example of a reserve study of this chart that you're looking at here, you see the gray is the cash flow, and you see it never dips below that baseline. The green is your funding plan. It's showing how much you're increasing. Now, naturally, that increases each year because it's offsetting inflation, right? And then the red bars are your expenses. So if you look at this particular graph, you see this kind of wave where you look at the green and you see coming off of the long red years, so your heavy expense years, is where the gray dips low. And now what reserve companies do is they look at what they call the critically low year, your threshold funding, so that when you're coming off of your largest expense years, you're always at a baseline. And that baseline really is not a magical number, but pretty much what they like to do to calculate what the formula is for that threshold year is take 3 months worth of your operating expenses or your operating income. 3 months together, what does that equal? That can be your baseline of what your threshold funding is. So when the reserve study company develops your plan, that's your critical low year that they want to say you don't want to dip below that. So that's their calculation over a 30-year period of making sure that you stay healthy. So the reserve study is just that. It's management of the cash flow. So that's why it becomes extremely important that you follow your study, especially with the funding. Because if you get into a habit of saying, well, we can't afford a dues increase to make up the reserve contribution increase this year, so we'll make it up next year, all of a sudden you fall behind. So it's really important that you just follow your study. And the last thing I'll say when it comes to reserve study management is follow the expenses. Now, a lot of people debate the reserve study and the validity of how accurate is it? Is it really, does the siding need to be replaced in 2 years, or can that wait 5 years? Whatever it might be, people always debate it and you move it around, and that's why you update the study every 3 years. But I will say this, please remember this sentence. The reserve study is accurate, and those expenses will have to be calculated or have to be done at some point anyway. So you move it around, fine, but if you moved it out, it just got that much more expensive. So reserve studies are very accurate, they're very disciplined, and you as a board need to be disciplined in following it. So hopefully that helps you as you look at your reserve study management. Again, follow the study like I began. That's the most important thing. Lots more on reserve studies and reserve study requirements and other videos at sharpermanagement.com.